Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum, a very good afternoon and welcome to the Talking Point TV show with myself Ahmed Bosan Al-Qadri, broadcasting live and interactive on Noor TV, Sky Channel 819 across Europe and throughout the world in many, many countries. As always, we are here each and every week with a whole hour full of education, information and much, much more. Lively debate and of course interesting discussions, being Noor TV's official weekly current affairs program here on the station. Now, this week there has been growing concern amongst many local elected members, local councillors for example, and I suppose it is fair to say not just councillors but also many elements of local communities, especially in places like Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool and a lot of places in fact affected by the disturbances, the riots that we all recall seeing or hearing about just a few months ago. For the government to review its policing cuts. As you may be aware, the government have announced that as part of cutbacks in light of the global recession and the economic turbulence that we're experiencing at the moment, the government have said on numerous occasions, as we have mentioned on this program, that cuts are needed to things like our public sector services. But how far do you go? Should the government be looking at reviewing the extent to which they are cutting the budget given to the police force in light of these disturbances and also in light of local councillors, for example here in Birmingham, from all parties, I think it's fair to say, calling for them to review the situation? Well, to discuss and debate this topic with me, I'm happy to say I have two fantastic panellists to my right. Someone who's by no means a stranger to you, the viewers of the Talking Point TV show here on Noor TV. Councillor Wasim Zafar currently serves as a councillor in the Lozells and East Handsworth ward here in Birmingham, one of the most deprived wards in the country. I think it's fair to say, Councillor Zafar. Wasim, welcome to the programme. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And then we have Councillor Gareth Moore, who currently represents the Erdington ward in Birmingham and is from the Conservative Party. Councillor Moore, Gareth, welcome to the show. Thank you for giving up your valuable time to be with us.
Not a problem, and thank you for the invite.
Now, if I could start off with yourself, Councillor Gareth Moore, you are obviously a Conservative elected member. At present, both in Birmingham, we have the Liberal Democrats and Conservatives running the council, and the situation is pretty much the same nationally. In light of the disturbances that we all saw across the country just around a month ago, is it time for the government to review these 20% policing cuts?
Well, I think obviously what happened in August was shocking and it was disgraceful, and there's no way that anyone should justify the actions of the individuals, the wanton destruction that they caused during that time, during the looting, particularly in London, Birmingham and other places across the country. But I think there is also the fact that we've got a larger problem at hand, and that is a massive deficit of millions of pounds. We're paying millions of pounds in interest every day. Those millions of pounds could be better spent on education, on putting more police on the streets. That money could be spent elsewhere. We have to make savings, unfortunately. And I think it will be unfair to say that the police department, in contrast to all the other departments, should not suffer these cuts as well, particularly when you can make reforms, you can make changes, you can make savings.
However, Councillor Gareth Moore, if people are to look at your policing cuts and then perhaps look at the level of youth cuts that we are also seeing, are you saying that these policing cuts that are going to be made are not going to affect the front line? Will there be an impact on the amount of police presence that we currently see on our streets once these 20% cuts have been implemented?
Well, I think what's clear that the Home Secretary Theresa May keeps saying is that they should not be affecting the frontline services. The savings should be made possible within the back staff, the back office staff, and all the other parts of the police that aren't on the front line. Police, obviously, the police inspectors have the opportunity to ensure that they protect their frontline services, and a lot of them do. A good example is obviously Chris Sims, the Chief Constable, and he said in Birmingham that they will be able to continue to provide frontline services at a high standard despite the reductions in their budget.
Councillor Zafar, the government is making these cuts specifically to policing. They're saying the front line is not going to be affected. It's necessary precaution, is it not, on the part of the government if they don't want us to go into more debt?
Ahmed, where do I start? These cuts and the argument that it will not affect frontline officers is quite ridiculous, to be honest with you. Chris Sims, the Chief Constable of the West Midlands Police, one of the first things he did when he came into office last April was restructure the West Midlands Police to make it leaner, to reduce wastage, and he took away neighbourhood level policing to ward-wide level policing, and there were substantial cuts up to nearly £40 million were made across the West Midlands force. In my ward in Lazars and East Handsworth, I lost 63% of my police constables working in the neighbourhood police because of the restructuring. I lost half my sergeants working in the ward. I lost police community support officers. Now, with the cuts that are that will be coming into place here in the West Midlands, £126 million over 4 years, 20% of the police budget, we're going to lose 1,200 frontline officers. How will that impact on my ward? I've already had substantial cuts last year. You know, losing 63% of my police constables in Lazars and East Handsworth. And what you said at the start of the programme when you were introducing me, my ward is one of the most socially deprived wards in the country, not just in the city of Birmingham. So I think the government and the Home Secretary need to think about this far more responsibly than they have. The recent disturbances, and I totally echo the sentiments of Gareth when he said that there's no reason for anyone to do what they did. There were thugs on the streets and opportunists. But all the main forces where there's been substantial cuts up and down the country were affected by the disturbance in the riots. And what was clear to see was there was less officers on the streets. I know, and I've said this before on this programme, the way the West Midlands Police handled the first day of the disturbances here in Birmingham was totally inappropriate. They didn't have sufficient officers on duty on that particular day. I know they had public trained officers that they didn't call in, but they didn't have the relevant resources to deal with the disturbances on the first day. Further reassurances were brought in later in the week. So my question is, with the restructuring that's already taken place and the £40-odd million of savings that the Chief Constables made with this new programme Paragon and take away neighbour policing, how will the cuts affect my constituents further on from that?
Councillor Moore, are you as a party being slightly disingenuous with the electorate out there and the British people in stating that the front line of policing will not be affected in light of what Councillor Zafar has just said? The amount of cuts that he's seen in his own ward directly affecting the officers that are on the streets in Lazars and East Handsworth, for example.
Well, first of all, I don't think we're being disingenuous. I think the ultimate thing is that at the top level they're making decisions that are perfectly acceptable. The people who implement them are obviously the police forces themselves. If the police forces decide differently, then obviously there's an issue there. They're the ones who decide, should I, let it affect frontline services or should I let it affect other services?
But surely, depending on what the government's telling them, if the government is putting forward a guidance and giving them a budget which they could perhaps, or Labour would describe as completely inadequate, or the police may find difficult to spread out across the various areas where they have to operate, the government are not really putting them into a good position, are they, in trying to protect them from losing a lot of their frontline services that they currently provide?
Well, I think the ultimate decision is obviously it still lies with the police forces themselves, and I think we've had examples in the past. I believe in the fire service in Manchester, there was I'm not sure who's in charge of the fire service there, but he stated that they can make the necessary savings without it affecting frontline services. You know, and if people at the top who are making those decisions follow that rule, look at it practically and in a practical sense and say, we can do this, there are ways of doing it. And that's the key issue. There are some people there who are just thinking, well, actually, no, I don't want to make those decisions because they're maybe a bit too tough, whatever. And so they're you know, obviously it's their decisions they're making.
Councillor Zafar, is it down to them rather than the government?
See, one of the things we need to understand is it's difficult for the Chief Constable to come out and criticise the government. He is in effect employed by the Home Secretary, so for him to come out and say he disagrees with the cuts, it'd be very, very difficult for him, and his position would certainly come into question in terms of how his relationship with the government is. You know, I was pleased to see at this special meeting that was called following the disturbances here in Birmingham of the City Council and the Members of Parliament. The leader of the council, who's a colleague of Garrett's, Councillor Whitby, said he'll be writing to the Home Secretary because he himself is not pleased with the level of cuts that West Midlands Police faces. I also understand. You know, I'm not saying that if today we had a Labour government, we wouldn't be making cuts across the police force. We would be making cuts, but it's the level of cuts we'd be making. I think we'd be looking at 11-12% rather than the 20% being implemented by this current government. And there are places where we can save money. Since 2008-2009 financial year, here in the West Midlands, there's been £6.9 million spent on consultants. And I'm not saying that, you know, we can get away with not using consultants at all. Consultants provide a specialist service, they provide a professional service, but do we need that level of cuts? Now, the other thing that's come of light recently here in the West Midlands is the police here are currently working with, I think, Surrey Police and possibly Staffordshire. I know Surrey Police is definitely one of them, are looking at commissioning private partners to deliver some of the services that you expect police officers to deliver. Now, that is shocking. Are we going to privatise sections of the police force? So, you know, when one of my constituents dials 999 to call in, the emergency services, gets across to the West Midlands police operator, will somebody on the other side of the world be answering the calls? Because it's cheaper to have somebody on the other side of the world to take these calls. You know, recently we saw G4S, I think, Policing Solutions, called in by West Midlands Police to look at some of the tackling terrorism issues here in the West Midlands. What they did was employ some of the officers that the police made redundant. So, in essence, the police were making officers redundant here in the West Midlands because of the restructuring and because of the cuts. And they were hiring a company who were in turn hiring the same people that the police were making redundant. This is ridiculous.
However, Councillor Zafar, Councillor Moore made the point that, in his opinion, sometimes, and if I understand you correctly, Councillor Moore, it's down to the person at the top of the police force, for example, being as we are talking about the police today, to ensure that the cuts being made don't affect the front line. Do you think that the Chief Constable of West Midlands Police, or whatever police force it may be up and down the country, has the freedom or has the ability to protect the front line in light of the cuts?
I think it'd be very, very difficult for the Chief Constable or the Chair of the West Midlands Police Authority to protect frontline services in light of the 20% cuts being imposed on them by this government. You've got to remember 80% of the budget of the police here at the West Midlands is largely dedicated to staffing, whether that's training, whether it's deployment of staff, whether it's staff wage itself. So there's going to be a huge squeeze on that itself. So I think it's an impossible task to ask of them. I know there's concerns. You know, there was a recent report on the BBC where they had a very experienced police officer who spoke anonymously around the difficulties and what the officers are currently discussing, because the burden when you lose frontline officers, the burden on the staff that remain on the frontline services is huge. You know, we're expecting in my ward, if you lose 63% of the police constables, the remaining police constables will have to carry out some of the duties of the ones that we've had to let go. So the burden on them, and then we have to look at stress levels, we have to look at the morale of the staff that we've got. There's huge issues there. So I think we're requesting the impossible if we say that we're going to impose 20% cuts to the West Midlands Police or other police forces and then just not have cuts to frontline services.
Councillor Moore, just as a point of clarification, do you accept or refute Councillor Zafar's point that you as a government are moving towards the privatisation or part privatisation of the police force?
Well, Well, I'd like to say that is, I'd refute that on the basis I don't think there's any mass privatisation of the police force. In fact, I think there are certain elements of the police force that is possible to bring in specialists who know what they're doing and obviously can provide a much better expertise, and obviously in terms of the public purse, a lot cheaper as well, and the fact that you can hire someone who knows what they're doing, who are experts in that particular field, and it's cheaper than obviously then having to set aside a variety of staff or hire a load of staff and train them to fulfil that role. In this case, it's going to be small examples, small areas where it may be possibly moved. Obviously, the prison is a good example of that, where we've got a specialist security company who will then be taking over control of the prison. But we're not going to be having, as you suggested, possibly, well, I certainly hope not, we're going to have call centres, you know, obviously in places like India, if you're making a call, a 999 call as well, particularly. That certainly isn't on the cards, as far as I'm aware.
Let's hope not.
Yes, certainly, yes, let's hope not.
Not to say that we've got anything against co-workers working in India.
No, obviously, no, not that either. So, but.
Absolutely, but I suppose you're talking about the importance of having things structured locally, the element of local knowledge, etc., especially when it comes to a 999 emergency phone call. Councillor Zafar, obviously we can look at the police cuts for what they are. We can see the figure there, and we can debate until the cows come home, really, whether it's going to affect the front line or whether it isn't, because it really truly is a matter of opinion, and we won't really see it until the cuts are fully implemented. But how are these cuts just on paper at the moment, and I suppose in reality to a certain extent in your ward, affecting the morale of people like your ward officers? Just clarify for the benefit of the viewers, who are the ward officers and what do they do?
The ward-wide neighbourhood policing team, we used to be called the neighbourhood police team because they used to work in neighbourhoods, but we've got some of the biggest wards in the country here in Birmingham. In fact, the biggest wards in the country. We've got, I think 30,000 people who live in our wards, 18,000 of them are on the electoral register.
Yeah, something like that.
So we've got huge wards here, and we've seen substantial cuts in police numbers within these wards. There was a recent survey out that was carried out with the West Midlands police workforce, so that includes back staff as well. I think there was over 4,500 people who responded to this particular survey. And some of the figures that came out, 53% of them said that they didn't feel, and this is police officers, police constables and PCSOs felt they didn't have the sufficient equipment to carry out their duties. So over half the police frontline police officers saying they haven't got sufficient equipment. Over two-thirds said they didn't feel that the police morale was high of staff. So it's clearly affecting our officers. These cuts and their future and the way they carry out their services, the way they provide a service to my constituents and the constituents of Gareth and other